So I'll start off by apologizing. This is the first time I've done a presentation in public in 2 years, so I got a lot of energy stored up. So you guys are going to be, and there's not a lot of people to take that energy. So like I said, Amanda Taylor, I've actually been with the NTSB for about 1.5 years at this point. Before that, I spent 15 years at the FAA doing crash testing research. Did a little everything from just testing restraints all the way up through, I actually dropped a regional jet out at NASA Langley as a part of collaborative efforts. So I've done a bunch of random stuff, and I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. But these people give you free shirts and pants. So, I mean, it's hard to say no. But anyway, so those caveats, and some of the photos that I have are from my time at the FAA at the Civil Aerospace Medical Institute. I've gotten permission to use them, but they're prototype testing type stuff. So I do talk a little bit about not just restraints. So it should be more exciting than just me telling you about seatbelts. But so first, and this is wonky, so this could be interesting. So I want to give you just kind of overall what I plan on talking about. So where you can find guidance about restraints and that type of stuff, different parts of the system, so things to think about, and then other considerations, and I have some case studies thrown in because accidents are interesting. And I want to keep everybody awake because it's towards the end of the show, and you know, you just never know. I don't want to be falling asleep out there. So the first place to go look, the first place that you see anything that has to do with restraints for an experimental or an amateur build is going to be inside the FAA's Advisory Circular 2027G. And that's simply your checklist. So if you built a home built, you probably have used something similar to this where you're checking off what you're doing. And what they talk about down here is fabricating seatbelt fittings and seatbelts and shoulder belts. You notice they don't go say find a type certificated FAA approved restraint, they say fabricate one. Meaning that for an experimental aircraft, it does not have to be FAA approved. But with that being said, you should still think about your intended use. What you're going to actually use your aircraft for, who's going to be in your aircraft, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So the first thing is, what kind of restraints do you want to put in? So this figure comes out of the U.S. Army's Crash Survival Design Guide, and I know I keep walking in front of it. I'm a pacer too, so I may fall off the stage. This could be really interesting. So I apologize. Just tell me to move. But this was trying to demonstrate, this is actual, if you ever want to look at crashworthiness features in any type of a vehicle, the Aircraft Crash Survival Design Guide, originally published in the 70s, is the place that I still go. It is my Bible when it comes to crashworthiness aspects, because even though the civilian side really didn't start getting into a lot of that crashworthy stuff until the late 80s, early 90s, the military had already started looking at that because warfighters are important and they are expensive to replace. So they wanted to do a better job protecting their warfighters. So we already had, before the civilian side ever even started getting into it, the military side had already put a lot of effort into crashworthiness. And so we tried to learn from that. So what you're seeing here, so if you ever talk to somebody and they don't have shoulder belts in their aircraft, I know, things blow up when I'm talking. Head path for a 95th percentile male is about 50 inches. So think about during an accident, your head flails forward, you're going to strike something with your head, potentially, within 50 inches. Think about what's in front of you. Then you add the extra 22 inches because your hands go further than your head. Well, if you're striking any type of hard surface, especially with your hands, and then you need to get out of an aircraft rapidly, that could be a real problem. So the first and foremost when it comes to restraints is that you add in an upper torso restraint. So this is one of the best figures for just documenting, just kind of showing people. So if you ever have people that say, I don't want to invest in that, that's going to cost me $1,000 or $50 or 10 cents. The difference in a full torso restraint and the head path, you've now reduced it by 20 inches for this particular size occupant. Think about, I mean, you're still going to potentially hit something. So I'm 5'2". I've got that seat scooted all the way up and lifted all the way up because otherwise I can't see over the lid. So I'm still going to have things that are going to be in my way. But now if you've greatly reduced that, think about your survivability now because you've moved yourself, you've held yourself back 20 inches. So if you ever have somebody that's like, why would I invest in this? This is the first spot that you can say, because of this. Because there's nice, pretty pictures, so if they don't want to get too technical, bad, good. So,
what is the reference to stuff again?
This is from where the seat pan and seat back.
What is the military reference?
Oh, Aircraft Crash Survival Design Guide. I still have it in paper copies because I'm one of those people, and it's about this big. It's 4 volumes. It's beautiful. And it's simple. So I mean, it'd be highly. I'm just kidding. So there we go. So first case study of the day. This is from 2006. This is a beach. They had engine issues, loss of power. They ended up having to ditch in the water. This is the beach. So they're that close to land. We had 2 fatalities. What they were attributed to, that's the pre-crash. And all of these, so all the case studies that I have, this young lady right here in the NTSB hat, Miss Beverly, she has copies of the factuals. So if you want any more information on any of the case studies that I bring up, or just think it's interesting to read, we got a bunch, so take them so we don't have to take them home. So, but what happened is, so they end up impacting the water. This is the recovery site. But what they found when they did the medical autopsies afterward is that they drowned, but it's from complications of blunt force trauma. So here you have, I mean, there were people, as you saw in that one, that picture of them impacting the water was taken by video. There were people on the water. So they were not they weren't just out in the middle of nowhere. Here they are in a populated area, and yet we have 2 fatalities. And an otherwise, I mean, when it comes to survivability, there is plenty of survivable, occupiable volume there. The accelerations when they hit the water was relatively low. That should not have been a fatality. No shoulder harnesses on board. So they impacted some type of a control surface when they impacted. And they knew they were going down, so they had time to slow down their airspeed just a little bit more. So this is another way. When you're trying to talk to people about shoulder harnesses, this is a good example, to show them and say, even a good, and this is a certificate, this isn't an experimental. These are not fatalities that should have happened. There we go. All right, so people have questions. Where do I find more information about how to install shoulder harnesses? What's useful information? So this is Advisory Circular 2134. It's FAA, shoulder harnesses, safety belt installations. Yes, it's meant for certificated aircraft, but there's still a lot of really good information. So it's a good place to go look because they talk about everything from the different hardware and webbing considerations. So, the strength of your system as a whole. The retractor types, what are you going to be doing with it and how fast you want your restraint to stop? Mounting considerations, how do you want to get that thing affixed? And this is an important part. This is something I'm passionate about. I had an accident that I worked that influenced that, but I'm not going to talk about that one today. Your restraint should be able to be released by one hand, a single point of release. You don't want, especially if you have passengers, novice flyers, you don't want them to have to pull a seatbelt over here and a buckle over here and a snap over here to get out. Because in an emergency, people don't stop to look around. I've seen people on videos getting out of aircraft, and even though they know they have to unbuckle the seatbelt, the first thing they do is grab the outside of the aircraft, try to pull themselves, then they have to stop, unbuckle. So single point of release. So 3 different types of buckles. The lift latch, like we all fly with, people are fairly familiar with. Push button is one that, especially if you have people that are flying that aren't used to aviation restraints, we all fly with, or we've all driven with push button. It's very familiar. So in a panic, you go into instinct. Well, a lot of people are familiar with push button style releases. And then a rotary buckle. And so that's going to be, your 4 points, your military, your 5 points. But when you're installing these, so if a restraint is just sitting there limp and you want to open it or disengage it, it should not take more than 12 pounds of force. If you've tightened it down because you're going to go fly and you've cinched it up to 30 pounds of force is what we consider when they're doing the certification testing for any restraint. Those are the general rule of thumb tensions that for a releasing mechanism. Because all of those, if it's FAA approved, it's supposed to be able to be released after the accident too. They don't say reuse them. This is not a reduce, reuse, recycle, but it should be able to be reduced or to be opened with 30 pounds or less of force. So, where to put lap belts. This is inside that Advisory Circular 2134. Some considerations for when you're putting your lap belt in place. So 45 degrees, this is your seat reference point. So that's just the hard parts where the seat back and the bottom come together. What this is saying is that really, optimally, you're less than 2 inches from that point. Sometimes there's things in place, you can't quite get it right ideally. but you don't want it any more than 2 inches forward because you have to think about, set that down so I don't throw it and make it mad. So when you start decelerating, first thing you have to do is get all the slack out of your system and then you stop. Well, if your seatbelt is 2 inches forward, you have to slide 2 more inches, then take the slack out, then you start stopping. So anytime you can put it a little bit, when you start moving it forward, that means your head pass is now going to be that much further forward in an accident. However, you don't want it so far back that it ends up being up at the top. So we don't want, and you still see this in some older aircraft, where the seatbelt just wraps around the seat back, or the seatbelt wraps around the seat back, and you end up with it in your abdomen. That's also bad for this reason. So, the good Lord gave us some really nice hard structures. Our pelvis is fantastic for grabbing a hold and holding you back. Your lap belt fits beautifully in there. But if you allow that lap belt to come off of the pelvis and go up into the abdomen, then what's going to stop you? Your spine. And between the front of your stomach and your spine, there's a lot of squishy things. These squishy things are not good to squish. So you don't want any type of restraint that's going to come up and allow pressure into the abdomen. So if they're doing a certification test for the FAA and that they see the seatbelt go up off the pelvis of the test dummy, it's an immediate fail and redesign. You cannot have anything up into the abdomen. So that's something to think about. You can even kind of move around in your restraint once you get it in there and see, all right, is this staying down where I want it? Or should I reconsider my geometry? So, next question. Like I said, a lot of these are from my days at the FAA. I did get permission to use them. People say, all right, we've decided to put a shoulder harness in. We think that's great. We want to stop the torso. Well, do I do 3, 4, or 5 points of restraint? What's the best for my use? And so that's what I'm going to talk about here. So first, you have your 3-point. This is familiar to everybody because that's what we ride in cars with. Also, people are used to it. So if you have people getting into your aircraft that are not familiar with 4 points and 5 points and rotary buckles and everything else, they're going to be familiar with this. Also, they can't screw this up. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. The downside to a 3-point is it allows for rollout. If the deceleration vector happens to be away from that shoulder belt, the occupant can roll out of it. And we don't like rollout because as you roll the spine, you reduce the tolerance. So the amount of load that you can take goes down. So that's not optimum. So 4-point. Now with the 4-point, again, setting it down so I don't throw it at somebody, you can now take acceleration from both sides, right? You're not quite as specific as to which direction you need to go. The problem that we find sometimes with 4 points is misuse. So as you rotate forward, if you haven't tightened the lap belt, it can allow the buckle to come up into the abdomen a little bit, and that's bad. Or you can have occupants that get nervous. So if you fly in helicopters and you're doing air tour, somebody's very excited, this is their first air tour, they're getting in the aircraft, and you know that for a 4-point, you tighten that lap belt nice and snug, and then all you do is take the slack out of the top. You don't cinch it down. Because if you cinch it down, you're bringing that buckle right up into the abdomen to start with. And that goes back to nothing in the squishy part of our bodies, bad. But what we've seen is that a pilot will go in, he'll load his passengers, then he goes around to the front and you see the passenger go, and they've now cinched it up and brought it up into their abdomen. So with a 4-point, it's better because you can take accelerations from either side, but there's a potential for misuse depending on who's going to be in it. If it's going to be you and your family or just you and you know how to tighten it, that's different, that's good. So then you go to the 5th point. So 5th point's great. It's got a crotch strap and it gives you an excuse to tell somebody to fasten their crotch. But with that 5th point of restraint, the whole point of it is to make sure that that lap belt stays over the pelvis. So that helps with misuse, but not everybody has structure there to use a 4-point or to use that 5th point of restraint. So that's where, but if you're doing acrobatics, maybe you find a way to make sure that there's structure there. So again, that goes intended use. So that's what the 5th point, the primary purpose of that 5th point is restraint, is to make sure that that lap belt stays over the pelvis properly to aid in non-misuse. So again, 3 points not as optimum as, a 4 or 5, but there's less likely that somebody's going to screw that up and bring that lap belt up off the pelvis. So again, think about your use as well as the structure around you. So where you attach it to, what you have to attach to it. So again, inside that 2134, another good place they talk about shoulder belt angles. So if you happen to have a shoulder belt you can now put in, but the only place you could anchor it was on the floor behind you, so that's all right, but can your seat, the seat back, and the seat structure underneath take it when you start coming forward? Is it designed to take that load, or are you going to end up causing damage to the back of your seat and your whole seat's going to come loose? So that's where you got to think about routing just a little bit. And then you say, all right, well, no, I'm going to go back to structure behind me. Much like the 2 inches, the lap belt being 2 inches forward, the more slack you have before you start taking the tension out, the further your head goes. So there's optimum angles for where that shoulder belt should be installed. And again, sometimes you just don't have the structure in the optimum angles. That's just life. So you end up having to have it a little bit down. But in this case, when you have a shoulder belt that's routed down, as you come forward, it actually puts a little bit of compression load on your spine. Sometimes that's acceptable. But those are just things to think about. And this is all just information they've got inside that advisory circular, as well as the Crash Survival Design Guide. So what I'm trying to do is give you the tools, not lecture you, but give you things to think about. Stir those juices. Get you excited because restraints are sexy. So, inertial reels. So now you've said, all right, I've got my lap belt in place, I've got my shoulder belt in place. I don't like a shoulder belt that doesn't let me move. I want that little bit of freedom that comes with an inertial reel so that I can touch things. I'm somebody that needs that because I'm short and I have a limited range, so to get to stuff. So there's 3 different types of inertial reels. So you have what's called webbing sensitive. That is just one where if it feels a rapid tug on the webbing, it'll lock up. Nice and simple. Dual sensing is just webbing sensitive and housing sensitive. So it's got 2 different ways that it'll lock up. It either feels the rapid tug, or if the whole housing starts slowing down, that will trigger it to stop too. And they're mechanical. They're nice and simple. There's no electronics. These puppies are just little levers. They're awesome. Now, manual locking, I normally don't talk about a whole lot with GA, but because some of y'all do I wasn't quite sure what kind of group I would get, but if you're doing acrobatics, so manual locking is something that we see primarily in transport category pilot seats. What that is on TT&L, which are the most dangerous phases of flight, they can actually lock out their inertial reel. So a good performing inertial reel will only pay out about 1 inch. So if you're going in and you're checking your restraint, it should not come out more than 1 inch, or you need to relook at it. Because, again, any extra space that you let your head move, you're that much closer to something hard. There's never something soft there. Except for a cheese head. I heard there was an accident where somebody was saved by a cheese head. I gotta look that up, because that's fancy. So, that is this system. It's a little bit more complicated. It's gonna require extra space as well as extra mounting places. But that's, if you're doing acrobatics and you're about to do some real swings, it'd be nice to be able to lock that out, just to give you a little bit better tether into your vehicle. But then when you're moving around doing your checks and doing a little space, you can unlock it. So, 3 different types of inertial reels. I forgot my water. So normally I drink water and that slows me down a little. So I apologize if I'm going too fast. Like I said, I haven't presented in front of people. I got a lot of pent-up energy. There we go. All right. So you said, all right, I've got an inertial reel now, I've got my shoulder belts. I want to absorb a little bit more energy though. All right. There's something called load limiters. So that takes even more. Any time inside of an airplane or anything, oh, you are wonderful. Thank you. Oh, that's fantastic. Anytime you can bend or warp or deform something on purpose, that's going to take energy out of you as the occupant, out of the system. So what these are relatively simple items. This particular one mounts in between an inertial reel and the structure. So when they do an FAA certification, there's actually a limit about how much, oh snap, forgot it was there. There's a limit as to how much compression your chest can take. Makes sense, right? They've got load limiters and everything in automotive. She went and got me one.
Okay.
Are you trying to tell me to slow down? I'll take a slow dance. stick to your next time. So this one's nice and simple. It's a simple aluminum U-bracket. It goes in between the structure and the inertial reel. And then as the restraints lock up and they start rotating forward, it just opens up. So for this particular crash test, it opened up about 1.5 inches. So that's the pre-test. This is the post-test. All right. So you can see this one opened up about 1 inch, that one about 1.5 inches. And these are the loads that we recorded during that test. So without the load limiter, we were over 2,000 pounds of force. This actually would have been considered a fail per FAA certification. But then they added that load limiter in place, and you're now looking at less than 1,000 pounds. So you've halved your load. And all it took was 1 inch, 1.5 inches. But again, as you're doing installations, make sure you consider, can I afford that 1 inch, 1.5 inches? Because that may get you too close to a structure as well. But here's a way to take lots of energy out. You say, all right, that's really nifty, but I don't have space for that. You know, we're already got an inertial reel packed in there, it's getting tight. So they actually have load limiters that go through the webbing. And this is an example of that. So this is one that is found where the webbing goes down into, the webbing routes through it, and same thing, it just opens up as the occupant comes forward. So it's a way that you could put it back in without having to tie in a structure or something like that. All right, so webbing routing. Where is your seatbelt webbing going? This is a test where we had a manufacturer that wanted to get rid of, they had headrests. Well, headrests in your vehicle is for rear impact. And unless you are doing something very wrong, we don't have rear impacts. You'd rather have the ability to see around, talk to people. So all they did is pull them out. After the test, they found this frame in the belt. And that frame is just as a result of this little dowel. It's a little piece of just hard plastic. It's one of those that you can kind of scrape it with your fingernail. It's not even really hard plastic, but it did that much damage because when you rapidly pull on a restraint, it doesn't take much to start fraying it if it's going over just a sharp edge of some sort. So something to think about how your webbing is routed. This was one. It is a inertial reel up in a housing because let's face it, while we think they're cool, they're ugly to look at. So usually they get hidden inside structure somewhere. This was one that we actually had a couple of accidents where they had restraints failed, but they looked like they'd been cut. So my background is not only the crash testing for 15 years, but EMS. And that's what it looks like when I take a pair of trauma shears to webbing. Now this could be, oh look, it's working. This was the test. The whole reason that restraint failed is because it was inside of that metallic housing, went over a 90-degree piece of metal, and just sheared off once the load got just right. Just initiated, and it looked like it didn't cut. So, like I said, prototype, this was not a cert test. So, airbags. I know there's a lot of questions about that. We're starting to see it more in GA. The storage device, I have no idea where the O comes from, and I apologize. I couldn't find it in time to do this, but this is now a kit. They have been approved for, it's either 451 or 541. I know it's those three numbers, I'm just not 100% sure about what the first number is. But what AmSafe did is work with the FAA on old GA aircraft and say, we want to make it better, we've got this kit. So the module itself lasts for 10 years. I want to say this costs like $2,000, $2,500 for 2 seat places. It can be installed by an A&P on site, and it uses this little body block. But it's just an airbag that comes up between the occupant and whatever's in front of them. So it's a barrier bag. This is what we call a barrier bag. And through some of the testing and the research that's been done is that even if the bag does not fire right in front of you, we actually found that it reduces the load to the lap belt anyway. So you're still getting benefit even if it happens to be off the one side or the other. But that was, they also have, so AMSafe, I reached out to my AMSafe partners, and they do have actual part numbers for the Lancer. So they have put them in experimentals, they are approved. Well, experimental, everything's approved. But, so they have had them on board, so. And that's what it looks like. So like if you ever get on a transport category, you see it in a bulkhead seat or something, and it looks like your restraint has swallowed a mouse. It probably has an airbag in it. They're usually thick, a little bit of leather on the outside, but this is what it looks like. Comes out of the lap belt and comes up in front of you. This is actually a Cirrus, a picture of Cirrus setup. Or a Cessna. Something else that is required during certification. So when planes, I put everything down, otherwise somebody's gonna get wet. So when planes come to a stop, even small planes, they found that on the floor, it doesn't stay perfectly flat. You get a little bit of twist, a little bit of warp. Even if eventually it does flatten back out, this motion during the deceleration is a good way to have your seat separate if you don't have a little bit in the system. When they do certification tests, they actually require a seat manufacturer to pitch one leg down, roll one leg out, and then they have to yaw at 10 degrees one way or the other. You don't have to do that for experimental, but think about that. When you're doing your installations, one thing that we used to find in accidents back in the 80s and 90s is that the seats would break off because they were too rigid and strong. They didn't have just that little bit built into them to give them flexibility during an accident sequence. I use the transport category just because it's a nice thing. All right, inspections. So a good place to go look is not only in the advisory circular, but the NTSB. So this is why I named it what I did it, and I realize it's like not the coolest title, but the NTSB actually has a safety alert talking about checking your restraints, inspecting it. So you need to have a, go take a look at your restraint. I see a lot of people's aircraft out here covered really well, protecting them from UV. So UV will degrade any fabric, any type of webbing. If you've got any type of like saltwater exposure, that type of stuff, inspecting your entire system at the same way that you inspect everything else. So at the 100 hour, and then, just a quick look prior to flight. So look for corrosion, cracks, bending, anything like that. But that's all more information that's in there. So here we have a case for degrading restraints. It's actually cited in ours. So this one was, I made sure to get notes so that I didn't mess it up. So aerial application flight, he was wire strike. Hit a wire, came down. He was one serious injury, but 2008. The restraint system itself, let me get it. There we go. So in 2 places, the restraint actually failed. It broke loose because of webbing degradation. And that actually added to his injuries and contributed to them being serious versus either minor or none, because he did not come in going that fast. He did lose his vertical stabilizer, so he didn't have a whole lot of control, but as ag flying, aerial ag, he was flying low and slow anyway. So there wasn't a lot of energy in the system, but yet you can also see, his seat wasn't exactly in great shape either. So it was one of those where you see that maybe care hasn't been given quite as much to some of the fabric items, things that you don't think about. Pull out the input your tissue and seat and go. This is from 2010. This is too serious. Let's see. This was a runway excursion light sport aircraft. There we go. This one actually has 2 different things. So yes, we have a restraint issue, but this also, we are starting to see parachutes inside some of our experimentals. This one, when they actually got to the scene, did the examination and everything, they did find that the handle had been pulled from the deploy situation. They ended up in a flat spin. So they'd actually pulled it out and tried to engage it. It did not go. What they found is that the glue on the end of the casing had actually dried up and shrunk, allowing the case during vibrations to slowly come undone, and therefore there was no pressure. It could not be fired. Luckily, you saw the accident itself. So you can see they still came in relatively, they weren't going too fast, they weren't too high. But we did have the 2 serious, but contributing to that, so their lap belts were still attached to where they'd been inside the aircraft, but all shoulder belts had come loose. So what had happened is, there's the right and the left, they were laying outside, probably when the guys got out, is when they ended up outside, but they had completely come untethered. So here's the shoulder belt attachment. It's mechanically attached to a piece of plywood that then goes to some epoxy, carbon layup, and then they just epoxied that to the sidewall. So when you put an epoxy piece together, it feels really strong, but in the crashworthiness world, we call them stickers because they peel right off. So this is what it looked like underneath those brackets. So they had just done an epoxy layup to the side of the aircraft, and that's how they came loose, contributing to their injuries because they were allowed to, their head moved further than it was supposed to. All right, this one's kind of interesting as well. So this happened in 2014. I actually worked this one when I was still at the FAA. We had 2 fatal, the front seat passengers, pilot, co-pilot. They were actually both airmen, active airmen. So I actually had Air Force support on this accident. 1 serious female in the back and 1 minor, and it happened to be a child, which is why they pulled me out. One of my specialties is child restraints and children involved in aviation accidents. So they pulled me out for that. This is what it looked like on scene. So this is something else. This was a composite aircraft. When they crashed, they should not look like this. This is a shattered eggshell of an aircraft. That there was poor fly layups and some other issues on top of that. So take, any type of fabric layup very serious. There we go. This is what it looked like when we got it back to the hangar. So the pretty much everything for the wing box had separated when they impacted. They ended up, it finally came to fruition that they had upgraded the engine and not the fuel line. So this was the first time they'd flown it with 4 people on board. And as they were taking off, it just got fuel started. They could not get enough fuel to the engine to then power it. So these are our pilot restraints. So a couple issues with these. One is the composite tear out. So this is the that center cable channel that goes down the middle. This is where the pilot restraints and the co-pilot restraints, you can see what's left of the circles, again, stickers. They've just been epoxied into the aircraft. This is what they look like when we got them off. So what they've done is they had made a nice buildup. So they had about a 4-inch patch. They put that down, put the bolt head inside, filled it with epoxy, and then put another layer on top. So this was about all of the layup. You can kind of see just how much of this is just epoxy material versus a full composite layup. And then they mechanically attached then to the bolt that was sticking out of this epoxy. But again, it literally just peeled off. This is our rear seat occupants. We had 2 occupants. This was a female, the mom of the child that was sitting in this seat, as well as the wife of one of the passengers, the 2 fatalities. Her restraint actually failed right through here. It was secured through the cable thing, but it pulled out. Honestly, I think the only reason that we didn't have issues with this is the young man that was sitting here weighed about 20 pounds. So he just didn't have a lot of force. And like I said, anytime you break something during an accident, that takes energy out of the system. At that point, everything for the wing box had sheared off, so it took a lot of energy out of the system, which is why she was only seriously injured. She was partially ejected. And this child was not at all. He had some good scrapes and he was pretty ticked off, but that's about it. So that was very fortunate. But her restraint, this was her restraint. So they had put it inside this, but they bolted it directly through. There's only 2 washers. Another issue is if you are making a mechanical connection inside of a composite of some sort, how much you crank it becomes very critical. One thing that we found when we examined it was there was actually a ring where they had over-tightened it and had pinched the fibers. Well, when you're pinching a composite, you're breaking the epoxy and you're breaking the fibers, and you've now reduced quite a bit of what load can be taken through that. And that's part of why this one pulled out. She only lost the left side and then rolled out a little bit, but at that point, that's as far as she went ejection-wise. So you have to make sure that what you're attached to is actually significant. All right, so like I said, child restraints. So I got to talk a little bit about child restraints because we do see them in experimentals. So there are regular child restraints that we're familiar with that are FAA approved. They'll say it on the side. Just means that they've been tested for inversion, for negative Gs, because that's something we don't get in aviation or in cars. And so, but this one right here, this is actually an aviation-specific child restraint. How it works, it wraps on the top around the seat back. These 2 shoulder pieces come down, and you route the lap belt through it, and then it clips in front. It takes up a lot less space than it uses what's already there. If you have a shoulder belt installed on this seat, you don't use the shoulder belt. This gets used instead. So you just take the shoulder belt off. If you ever have questions or anything like that about child restraints, the FAA has a site where you can go get a little bit more information about flying with them. But we also have a safety alert, mostly because we realize that there's not a requirement for 2 and under to have their own seat. And that doesn't matter if you're in the transport category or in a small experimental. It's not required. However, you should really think about it, even in bad turbulence, what that child's going to do. whether it's injure you as the pilot because they've now become, what do the Australians call it? They used to term those not appropriate, but that's the Aussies for you. But essentially it becomes unrestrained mass. That's how they refer to any child unsecured inside the aircraft, no different than a laptop. It can then interfere with you, especially if you're just a two-seater. So, did it again, sorry. So think about that. All right, so this one is 2017, an experimental BD4, one fatal, one serious, and one non-injury. So they were going to take off, ran off the end of the runway, hit this truck, and ended up in a crumpled ball on the side. So this is what it looks like afterwards. The pilot was our fatality. The mom sitting next to him was not. And then right here in the very back was our third non-injured passenger, and it was actually a child in a rear-facing child restraint. There we go. So of all the people flying in any type of aircraft or even driving, a rear-facing child in a properly secured rear-facing child restraint is the most protected occupant out there. So that saved that child's life. Otherwise, he would have easily been infected, would have been a fatality as well. Helmets. I know that that's not necessarily something everybody uses, but it is something that some of y'all use. So this was one of the early helmets. Oh, I had an airbag fun fact. Sorry. Pause for a moment. Airbag fun fact. Did you know that back in the 70s, they originally invented airbags for use in aviation? However, at the time, they were too heavy, they were too unreliable, and too expensive to put in. So the automotive community developed them and brought them to fruition, and that's why there was this lag between in automotive, where weight's not so critical, and now aviation, where we've got the technology to make them lightweight and useful. Sorry about that. This break's sponsored by you. All right, so helmets. So this was a 1912. We've been looking at protective flight helmets for over 100 years now, and that's how you do it. It's right up there with the guy testing the bulletproof vest with somebody shooting at him from 10 feet away. Sometimes you just got to prove concept. So helmets. There is not, the FAA does not have a helmet standard. They looked at what the military had already done and they said, why would we recreate it? And I agree with that. The problem being, a mil-spec helmet is a little bit more expensive because they not only have to meet, especially for fixed wing, so not only are they protecting you in all of these areas, but they also have to survive wind shear, ejection seats, they're going to get blown off, so they've got extra webbing that's not necessary. Ballistics, they're also there to fight off shrapnel or something that might come in. They also have something just like packaging requirements, what box it's allowed to be shipped in, and what that box is going to look like, weigh, and be consisted of. So that adds to the cost. Like anything certified, that adds to the cost. So the FAA said, they declined, said, we're not going to create a standard because we're reinventing the wheel. But the Department of the Interior, who has a lot of helicopters flying and a lot of crew that are wearing helmets, said, well, there's a need for a civilian standard. We can't just go off the military because we don't need to worry about wind shear. And so the Department of the Interior actually came up with a standalone standard, and it simplified it quite a bit, but it kept the impact points the same. So there's a difference between a fixed wing and a rotary wing helmet, and that's primarily in the sides and where they get impact tested. So laterally, we're all about the same, but with a rotorcraft, when you start looking at the fact that they tend to roll over or land on their side, there's a few extra points on the side that they test for. So if you do have a helmet, and it's a flight helmet, you need to just make sure that it fits your application, that the slide changes when I ask it to. There it goes. So make sure that when you buy it, make sure that it is certified for what you want to use it for, and where it's, what the lab does. Inspect it just like you inspect everything else. So when the webbing starts degrading, the foam starts degrading inside, that actually reduces its functionality. Make sure that there's no cracks, lining looks good, that kind of stuff. And some people even, you can ship it out to labs to get inspected by a third party if you really want it, which, if you're doing maybe an AirMed or something like that, you might do. But the fit should be very snug and proper. The NTSB has a safety alert out. We had a helicopter accident, so think about your communications cords. They usually get stuck straight up or straight in. Well, if you're trying to get out, you've got a helmet on that's strapped on because it fits good, and you try to get out of the helicopter really fast or even the airplane really fast, you're now pulling this cord 90 degrees offset from its connection, and it's not going to come out. So we put out a safety alert a while back that said, you know, if this is the case and your path to egress is 90 degrees offset, put a pigtail in. Because, like I said, single point of release, you want to have to undo one thing to get out of the airplane. Now you've got to undo this and pull this cord, and you don't want to be trying to get away from something. So you can get a little pigtail to put in just to keep you from having to worry about one other thing, and it'll just pull out as you run away. The other thing is making sure that if you have a head-worn mask, that you've got it balanced on your neck. I know there's a lot of people that don't want to fly with helmets because they say, well, I'm not going to crash, and my neck's going to get tired. And while that is admirable, and your neck will get tired, the important thing is making sure that if you add mass to the front, you have balancing mass to the back. Keep the weight evenly distributed on your neck, or you will have, you'll get fatigued after a while. You don't want to have to constantly be looking up to balance out the mass on your head. So, and that's just daily life type stuff. So, I don't actually know what time I get done, but I talked a little bit faster than I meant to, so I apologize. But these are different places if you want to connect with us. We also have a booth over there. So if you have any questions about NTSB and general accident investigations, that type stuff, feel free to reach out to us. There we go. All right, and that is it. You're welcome. You can all be done now.